Welcome to the deep dive. So, you've brought us some really fascinating source material today. We're looking at the recent elections in Pakistan.
Yeah, specifically focusing on Imran Khan's party, PTI.
Right, Pakistan, Tariqi Insaf. And the situation was, well, pretty challenging for them. Khan was in jail, the party under huge pressure.
Immense pressure. Yet, somehow, candidates backed by PTI ended up as the largest single bloc in parliament. It's quite the outcome.
It really is. And the sources you shared, especially that Atlantic Council analysis, seem to suggest technology played a massive role here.
That's the argument. Obviously, things like inflation, youth anger, those were factors. But this analysis singles out PTI's, let's say, sophisticated use of digital tools as a key differentiator.
How they managed to campaign effectively despite everything.
Exactly. When the normal routes rallies, mainstream media were blocked, they went digital, heavily.
So it wasn't just like a nice-to-have add-on. It was core to their strategy.
It seems fundamental based on this analysis.
Okay, so the mission for us today, for this deep dive, using your sources, is to really unpack how PTI used technology to, well, navigate that landscape and, as the analysis suggests, do much better than expected.
Let's dive in.
Where do we start? What's the first major point from the source?
Okay, first up, the Atlantic Council piece really emphasizes this idea of fostering innovation from the bottom up.
Bottom-up innovation. Okay, what does that mean in this context? Why is that so important, especially when a party's facing repression?
Well, think about it. For a big movement, especially one with a really energized base, you can't just have orders coming down from the top.
Right, especially if the top is, well, constrained.
Precisely. You need to empower the people on the ground, the grassroots. When the main channels get shut down, you need supporters who can just, find other ways, adapt.
And the source says PTI's base, particularly younger supporters, were very tech-savvy and did exactly that. They improvised.
They really did. It gives examples, like when leaders couldn't hold physical rallies, volunteers just set up virtual ones, online gatherings.
Using things like Twitter Spaces.
Yeah, for live audio events. Or PTI-leaning experts, if they couldn't get on TV talk shows, they just pivoted to YouTube, started their own discussions there.
Very adaptable. And there were specific tech examples, too, weren't there? Like using GitHub.
Yes. That was fascinating. When the party websites got blocked, volunteers launched a candidate information portal on GitHub.
Which is usually for software developers, right?
Exactly. It's collaborative, harder to censor in traditional ways. It was a quick workaround to get information out.
And the chatbot, linked to Imran Khan's Facebook page. What was its role?
Think of it like an automated helper. It could give out candidate info, campaign updates, answer basic questions instantly to loads of people.
Scaling communication.
Right, without needing tons of staff replying individually. Direct communication at scale.
The source also mentioned an open-source repository for election data.
Yeah, basically a public online database. They put electoral data out there for anyone to check.
Why do that?
Well, the stated reason was to back up their claims about potential election manipulation, inviting scrutiny, essentially using tech for transparency.
Now, the analysis does mention online trolling associated with PTI supporters.
It does acknowledge that, but it argues the strategic advantage wasn't the trolling, it was this huge decentralized network, this sort of collective intelligence of tech-savvy young people wanting change.
So every time the authorities tried to shut one door,
This network found another way. A digital workaround. They were constantly adapting.
that distributed power is something else. Okay, so that's the bottom-up innovation. What's next? You mentioned AI.
Ah, yes. This is where it gets really interesting technologically speaking.
How so?
Well, the huge problem was Khan being in jail. Lots of other leaders were on the run or keeping a low profile. How do you run a campaign without your main figurehead visible?
A massive challenge. And the source says AI was the answer. How?
So according to the analysis, Khan would pass messages to his lawyers, but instead of just releasing text statements,
He did something else.
they used those messages as scripts to generate audio and even video content using AI voice cloning. So it sounded like Khan himself speaking.
Wait, really? AI generated content in his actual voice?
That's what the source details. It allowed him to virtually speak to millions.
Wow. So despite being physically absent?
He remained present. It kept the base fired up, kept him in the news, bypassed the physical limitations. It's a pretty striking use of AI in politics.
Absolute groundbreaking in that context. Okay, so AI was a key tactic. What else did the analysis highlight? Peer-to-peer networks.
Yes, building on that bottom-up energy. You have to remember, Pakistan has seen huge digital growth. almost 130 million mobile broadband users.
So people are getting information differently now. Less top-down media.
Much more decentralized.
Yeah.
Through their phones, social media, messaging apps, and PTI, which was already active online, apparently really doubled down on peer-to-peer this time.
Meaning direct supporter-to-supporter communication.
Exactly. Using platforms like WhatsApp extensively. It wasn't just broadcasting messages out. It was about volunteers creating countless interconnected groups, sharing info directly person to person.
Like a massive digital word-of-mouth network.
Sort of, yeah. And the source gives a killer example of why this was so vital. The election symbol ban.
Ah, right. The cricket bat symbol was banned by the Supreme Court. That must have been a huge blow.
Massive. In a country where many voters rely on symbols to identify candidates, especially with lower literacy rates, suddenly losing your well-known symbol is chaos.
People wouldn't know who to vote for or what symbol represented the PTI-backed candidate in their area.
Exactly. And candidates ended up with different symbols in different constituencies. It was confusing.
And traditional media wasn't going to help clarify that quickly or reliably.
Not necessarily, or not consistently, across all areas. This is where that peer-to-peer network, especially WhatsApp, became absolutely crucial.
How did it help?
Volunteers use these networks to rapidly spread the word locally. Here's your PTI-backed candidate, here's their name, and here's their new symbol for this area. They shared images, instructions.
Directly to voters, bypassing any media blockades or confusion.
Completely bypassed them. It allowed PTI to get that critical, time-sensitive voting information directly into the hands of voters.
Controlling the message and ensuring people could actually cast their vote correctly.
It turned every volunteer with a phone into a crucial information node.
That personal touch, that directness feels powerful. And this digital skill, it didn't just stay online, did it? The analysis says it affected the traditional news cycle, too.
Yeah, this is another interesting layer. By being so active and creative online, the virtual events, the AI messages, reacting quickly to news PTI, constantly generated buzz. They made themselves newsworthy.
So even if mainstream outlets were reluctant to cover them directly.
They almost had to. The digital noise was too loud to ignore. PTI kept creating stories that demanded attention. The source mentions getting pieces into international media, too, like that Khan op-ed in The Economist.
Right before the election, yeah.
And all this online activity, this constant relevance, it forced the establishment, the governing status quo, as the source puts it, to react.
Which then created another news cycle.
Exactly. Their reactions, the debates about PTI's messaging, it all got covered on traditional talk shows, in newspapers, even if sometimes they reportedly couldn't mention PTI or Khan by name directly.
So the digital strategy was basically weaponized to force their way back into the mainstream conversation.
It seems that way. It allowed them to keep shaping the narrative, pushing their message about being repressed, about the election potentially not reflecting the people's will.
Masterfully using digital to influence the traditional. Okay, there's one more major point in the analysis, isn't there? Contrasting PTI with their rivals.
Yes, and it's a stark contrast according to the source. It argues that PTI's opponents largely stuck to the old ways.
Entrenched in conventional campaign tactics, I think was the phrase.
That's the one. They just didn't seem to adapt to the digital age in the same way or with the same, agility.
And the result was?
They struggled to keep pace. Their messages didn't resonate as much with a population increasingly online. And the main counter-move from the status quo, mentioned in the analysis, was trying to block the internet.
Which seems like a direct admission that PTI's digital game was working, right?
You could certainly read it that way, but the analysis says it backfired.
How so? Didn't blocking the internet stop the messages?
Apparently not effectively,
Good.
for two main reasons highlighted in the source. First, people just used VPNs.
Virtual private networks, tools to get around blocks.
Exactly. Tech-savvy users could just bypass the restrictions. But second, and maybe more importantly,
Yes.
the act of blocking the internet itself became a huge story. It generated outrage, discussion about censorship.
Which played right into PTI's hands.
Precisely. According to the analysis, it actually reinforced PTI's narrative. It looked like state repression in action, validating their core message.
Wow. So the attempts to control the digital space actually ended up amplifying PTI's message and making the authorities look bad.
The suppression attempts became part of the story of suppression. A kind of Streisand effect, maybe?
That's fascinating. Okay, so let's try and pull this all together. The analysis suggests that this combination, the bottom-up innovation, the AI usage, the peer-to-peer networks dominating the news cycle, and opponents failing to adapt, all combined.
Led to a more informed, more engaged electorate and ultimately significant electoral gains for PTI-backed candidates, letting them outperform expectations against heavy odds.
The big takeaway here, based on this source, seems to be that tech wasn't just supplementary. It fundamentally changed how they campaigned and connected.
Yeah, the analysis presents it as a real case study, how digital tools can be used, maybe unexpectedly, to challenge entrenched power.
And for you, listening and thinking critically, this deep dive shows it wasn't just about old school politics. It was a very modern, digital-first approach in a world where information flows very differently now.
Definitely. And it leaves us with a final thought, drawing from the source's conclusion. It notes that while trying to control the internet didn't fully work against PTI this time.
The threat to internet freedom is still very real.
Exactly. The source flags that concern. So, it raises a bigger question for you to think about. As digital tools keep empowering citizens and political challengers in new ways all over the world, how will established powers respond? What does this tug-of-war mean for internet freedom globally?
Something to definitely mull over.